Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 352. And this time I'm going to talk about this record from 1979, A Day of the Sun by Masahiko Togashi and Isao Suzuki. This is a first pressing from 1979. That was the only year in which this was released on vinyl. There have been some CD reissues since. This is a duet record on Paddle Wheel Records, which is a sub-imprint of King. Togashi is a drummer and percussionist. Suzuki is primarily known as a bass player. Of the two, Suzuki is probably the better-known musician. He is associated normally in his career with hard bop and more straight-ahead jazz. He's a musician of serious stature within the Japanese and international jazz communities. For his part, Togashi shares those roots, but in the 1960s migrated much more squarely towards free jazz, and he's really one of the great originators and key figures of free jazz and fusion in Japan in the late 60s and early 70s. This album is a significant departure for both artists and kind of a one-off, because by the 1970s, when this comes out, both hard bop and free jazz and fusion had drifted out of fashion in Japan, as they had elsewhere, globally too. So it was time to experiment. And it isn't really like a lot of other records, certainly that I have in my catalog. It's more structured than free jazz, it's more mellow than fusion, but it's definitely not hard bop, it's definitely not smooth jazz. If anything, at times it flirts with being ambient, but if there's one record I have to which I could make a direct comparison, it's with that duet record by Elvin Jones and Richard Davis, Heavy Sounds. Masahiko Togashi, one of the most highly regarded drummers in all of Japanese music, is born in March 1940 in Tokyo. His musical journey begins on the violin, but around age 10 he switches to the drums. His dad was also a jazz musician, a bass player with a big swing band, and such was his son's talent that Masahiko at age 14 was being included in his dad's band's performances. By his later teens, he was playing regularly as a professional. He got some work with Tony Scott during Tony Scott's Far Eastern Adventures, and then he ends up joining the so-called Cozy Quartet. The Cozy Quartet was one of the best early all-Japanese jazz groups. It was originally led by the pioneering Japanese jazz piano player Toshiko Akiyoshi. Toshiko ends up moving to the United States in early 1956 to study music in Boston. And so another member of the group, the alto player Sadao Watanabe, who of course goes on to be another great Japanese jazz legend, takes over the leadership of the Cozy Quartet. And on March 9th, 1958, just 2 weeks shy of his 18th birthday, Masahiko Togashi and Sadao Watanabe and the rest of the Cozy Quartet play a gig at the Video Hall in Tokyo, and this was a concert which was supposed to present the best 4 small jazz compos in the country. The concert's recorded, it's Togashi's first appearance on record, and it's released as an album by King the following year in 1959. That begins a decade for Togashi of recording on and off with Sadao Watanabe. He's on a 1961 record on Toshiba, the fabulously named Battle of Funky, which cannot be found for love or money as far as I can tell. That same year, he's on something of a homecoming album for Toshiko Akiyoshi called Toshiko Meets Her Old Pals, which is, as it sounds, a reuniting of the great piano player with some of her former Japanese bandmates. That's a live record. Throughout the 1960s, Togashi occasionally leads his own small groups, but he functions primarily as a sideman, and he appears on a number of Sadao Watanabe's bossa nova records. As was common for a lot of top-ranked Japanese players in the 1960s, he also got a fair amount of work backing up touring American jazz musicians who came on their own and picked up a band. Through these kinds of arrangements, he ends up playing with Blue Mitchell, Lee Morgan, Sonny Rollins, and Ornette Coleman. Throughout the whole decade of the 1960s, he continues his association with Sadao Watanabe, but his own preferences were decidedly less mellow and less status quo, so he starts his own free jazz quartet. The other members of the quartet included the tenor player Mototaro Takagi. It also included the bass player Motoharu Yoshizawa, who had migrated from straight-ahead jazz towards more free jazz by the end of the 1960s, and he had actually gigged with Elvin Jones when Elvin came to Japan on his post-Coltrane Japan tour. And the final member of the group was the guitar player Masayuki Takayanagi, who had been a major driver of the whole avant-garde scene in Japan. He had been a big part of what was called the Jin Paris sound, which was named after a club in the Ginza where they regularly had essentially new thing drop-in sessions in the early 1960s. There's one very famous session which was recorded and latterly released on the Three Blind Mice label. That's called Jin Paris Session, and it's a recording which also happens to feature Togashi on drums. The Togashi Quartet releases 2 records in 1969, Now We Create and Speed in Space. These are, no way to sugarcoat it, pretty hardcore experimental free jazz, very well reviewed, very well regarded, and quite difficult to pick up, but a little too zany for me. But the same year those records came out was a difficult year for Togashi because he was in an accident which ends up leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Obviously, a terrible thing to happen to anyone, but of course, as a drummer too, he'd lost the use of his legs. So, for a few years, he's basically restricted to being a percussionist, but eventually he manages to create a drum kit which allows him to play while he's still sitting in his wheelchair. His style is obviously amended, but if anything, it made him even more innovative. His circumstances understandably made it difficult for him to tour, but he was a drummer and percussionist of some renown, and he got plenty of work also in the 1970s, working with, recording, and occasionally backing up touring US musicians, as he had done in the 1960s. So he plays with people like Don Cherry, Steve Lacy, Dave Holland, Charlie Hayden, and others. And it was in the 1970s, too, that he begins to collaborate with Isao Suzuki, his duet partner here. They had, of course, appeared here and there together on Sadao Watanabe projects, but this is the first time when they really do start to work together. Now, regular viewers may recall that I provided some background on Isao Suzuki in episode 277 when I reviewed his record Blow Up, which is a tremendous record, and recall that his jazz career only starts at age 20 after he goes to see Louis Armstrong, and he's absolutely smitten with Milt Hinton's bass playing. He hones his craft initially playing in strip clubs. He then becomes, over time, a real mainstay of the whole small but significant hard bop scene in Japan. He and Togashi played together briefly with Sadao Watanabe in 1966, and in the late 60s, Suzuki then heads off to the United States to join Art Blakey. He spends a lot of time in New York as a consequence. He plays with all kinds of jazz legends. He learns about production from Rudy Van Gelder. He comes back to Japan after 2 years, and at that point in the mid 70s makes what I think is the very best music of his whole career, particularly things on the Three Blind Mice label like Blow Up and Blue City, which sound incredible. This record is made over 3 days, February 1st through 3rd, 1979, at King Records Studio 2 in Tokyo. It's made, as I mentioned, for the Paddle Wheel label, which is kind of a general jazz sub-imprint of King Records. Other than generally being jazz, there's not really much that unites the artists on that label. Suzuki plays bass, piccolo bass, cello, and the Selena synth, and Togashi plays his modified drum kit. He also plays percussion and two different synths. Sonically, it is, unsurprisingly, absolutely amazing. Anything with Suzuki involved at this stage in his career really tends to sound good. The producer is Motohiko Takawa, and the engineer is Hatsuro Takanami, but you can bet that Suzuki had a hand in the production as well. Side one starts with a Suzuki composition, the title track, A Day of the Sun, where you have this trippy synth. It then leads into like an almost carnival-like drum groove, and when the groove settles down, Suzuki enters and really goes to town in the double bass. This is not only captivating music, it has these incredibly rich and detailed lows, exactly what you want for what is clearly a bass-heavy record. The next track is a Togashi composition, Birth of the Yellow Eggs, and this features Suzuki on cello, cutting like a knife through the sky, and then what I think is a piccolo bass. Really interesting textures and sonics in this one. The final track on side one is a Suzuki composition called Lonely Blue. And on this, the drum solo reaches a recording standard rarely surpassed in my experience. And another highlight is this very dreamy high register bass solo. Side two begins with a track composed by Togashi called Creatures in the Deep Blue Sea. This has an ominous kind of beginning, sort of building up with synth and drums, and it all builds to this epic gong. Now, I'm not one to recommend that people engage in altered states when listening to jazz, but I think this particular track is probably one of those where it might be of benefit to have partaken of some of nature's finest sacraments. Suzuki's Silver Flash is this staccato feeling track with some superb double bass work, but that double bass work is surpassed on the final track of the record, which is a Togashi composition called Awakening of the Fresh Green. Suzuki here is working high up in the register of his instrument, and he gets a lyricism and a clarity of tone which often escape even the very best bass players. This is a delightful record, but be warned that it's a little different than anything else either of these musicians ever recorded. As mentioned, it's a little bit ambient, and it definitely deals in soundscapes at times, but to be clear, this is not a boring record, not boring background music. It's very exciting. If you have a good system, this will bring the very best out of your components with those fantastic low tones that Japanese producers were able to get in the 1970s. It's definitely a two fingers of Scotch record. I look forward to playing it again and again, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.